The morning of December 14th, 1944, aboard the USS Fletcher, a destroyer cutting through the Philippine Sea, Seaman First Class Robert Chen stood on the aft deck watching something that should have been impossible. A Japanese pilot, his Zero riddled with American .50 caliber rounds, engine trailing black smoke, canopy shattered, was still flying, still maneuvering, still attempting to line up an attack run on the Fletcher's starboard side. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Chen had watched American pilots bail out with less damage, had seen P-38 Lightnings limp home after taking single hits to non-critical systems, yet here was an enemy aircraft that looked like it had flown through a metal storm, and the pilot inside was still fighting. The Zero passed 200 yards off the Fletcher's beam, close enough that Chen could see the pilots, head moving in the cockpit, searching for his attack angle despite the fact that his plane was dying around him. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The destroyer's 5-inch guns tracked the Zero, but held fire. The aircraft was clearly finished. It would ditch in the ocean or explode from engine failure within minutes. No need to waste ammunition on a dead man. Except the pilot didn't behave like a dead man. He coaxed his shattered aircraft into a shallow dive, aimed directly at the Fletcher's superstructure, and committed to an attack that American naval doctrine said he should have abandoned 3 minutes earlier when his engine first took damage. What Chen was witnessing, what thousands of American servicemen were encountering across the Pacific in late 1944, was a psychological phenomenon that American military planners had completely failed to predict. Japanese servicemen, from elite pilots to conscripted infantry, were fighting with a ferocity that violated every Western assumption about human behavior under impossible circumstances. They didn't surrender when surrounded, didn't retreat when outgunned, didn't abandon missions when their equipment failed. American intelligence officers had compiled reports throughout 1943 describing this pattern, but senior commanders dismissed the accounts as exaggeration. Combat stress made men see determination as fanaticism. Fear made ordinary resistance seem superhuman. The Japanese fought hard, certainly, but no harder than Germans had fought on the Eastern Front or Americans had fought at places like Bataan. By December 1944, that comfortable dismissal had shattered against overwhelming evidence. The kamikazes were the most visible manifestation, but they were merely the extreme end of a spectrum that encompassed the entire Japanese military. From Saipan to Leyte Gulf, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, American forces were colliding with an enemy whose psychology operated on principles entirely alien to Western military tradition. Understanding why required understanding what the Japanese military had built in the minds of its servicemen during the years before the war. A belief system so comprehensive, so deeply embedded, that it transformed ordinary men into fighters who considered death preferable to dishonor, who saw surrender not as a tactical option, but as a moral impossibility, who believed, with absolute conviction, that their emperor was divine and their cause sacred. American planners in Washington had intelligence about Japanese military indoctrination. They had captured training manuals, interrogated prisoners, analyzed propaganda. But they made a critical error. They assumed that ideology, however intense, would crumble when confronted with material reality, that soldiers who watched their comrades die, their equipment fail, and their strategic position collapse would eventually choose survival over abstract principles. That assumption, rooted in Western military history and rationalist philosophy, would prove catastrophically wrong, and the cost of that misunderstanding would be measured in American casualties that shocked commanders who thought they understood the nature of the Pacific War. The foundation of Japanese military psychology was laid not in 1941 when the war began, but in the decades preceding it. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 had transformed Japan from a feudal society into an industrial power within a single generation. But the architects of that transformation deliberately preserved elements of the samurai warrior code, Bushido, and incorporated them into modern military doctrine. The Imperial Rescript to soldiers and sailors, issued by Emperor Meiji in 1882, became the foundational document of Japanese military culture. Every soldier memorized its 2,650 words. The Rescript didn't simply provide tactical guidance or organizational structure. It defined the soldier's relationship to the emperor in terms that were explicitly religious. "We are your supreme commander-in-chief. Our relations with you will be most intimate when we rely upon you as our limbs and you look up to us as your head." The language positioned the emperor not as a political leader, but as the literal embodiment of the nation. Soldiers didn't serve Japan. They were extensions of the emperor's will, components of his physical body. This wasn't metaphor or poetic language. Japanese military training treated it as objective truth. The education system, reformed in the late 19th century, reinforced this worldview from childhood. Elementary school students learned that Japan's creation resulted from divine intervention, that the emperor descended directly from the sun goddess Amaterasu, that the Japanese people were inherently superior to other races due to this divine ancestry. By the time young men entered military service in the 1930s and early 1940s, they had spent 15 years absorbing a worldview in which individual life had meaning only in service to the collective embodied by the emperor. Western concepts of individual rights, personal autonomy, or the value of a single human life were not merely foreign. They were incomprehensible. Military training intensified this indoctrination through methods that horrified Western observers who learned about them after the war. Basic training in the Imperial Japanese Army lasted approximately 2 years, vastly longer than the 3 to 4 months typical in American or British forces. The extended timeline allowed for psychological conditioning that went far beyond teaching combat skills. Recruits were subjected to systematic brutality designed to break individual will and rebuild identity around group loyalty. Officers beat soldiers for minor infractions. Senior enlisted men beat junior enlisted men as part of daily routine. The violence wasn't random or sadistic, though it certainly appeared that way. It served a specific purpose: to teach that personal suffering was irrelevant, that individual pain meant nothing compared to unit cohesion and mission success. Private Yoshio Nakamura, who survived the war and published his memoir in 1953 after Japanese censorship laws were reformed, described his training experience in 1941. "We were beaten every day, for arriving 1 second late to formation, for failing to polish boots to perfect shine, for hesitating before obeying an order. The officers told us that our bodies belonged to the emperor, not to ourselves, that we had no right to feel pain or fear, that these were selfish emotions that betrayed our divine mission." The training also incorporated deliberate psychological techniques to associate death with honor and survival, with shame. Recruits practiced bayonet charges while shouting, "Tenno Heika Banzai," "Long live the emperor." They were taught that killing the enemy was secondary to the willingness to die in the attempt. Success in combat was measured not by surviving to fight another day, but by demonstrating absolute commitment to the attack regardless of personal cost. This inverted Western military logic entirely. American and British forces trained soldiers to accomplish objectives while minimizing casualties. Japanese training taught that casualties were proof of sincerity. A soldier who survived a battle had not fought hard enough. A unit that retreated had dishonored itself regardless of tactical circumstances. The concept of surrender became particularly twisted within this framework. The 1929 Geneva Convention established international standards for treatment of prisoners of war, recognizing that soldiers who surrendered under hopeless circumstances had not committed a crime. Most Western militaries taught their troops that surrender, while not preferred, was acceptable when continued resistance meant certain death without military purpose. Japanese military doctrine rejected this entirely. The 1941 Senjin-kun, or Instructions for the Battlefield, made the position explicit. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to ensure you do not leave behind a dishonorable name. This wasn't advice. It was a binding order with profound consequences. Soldiers who surrendered brought shame not only upon themselves but upon their families. Japanese military police maintained detailed records of servicemen's behavior. A soldier's family could be ostracized, denied employment, or subjected to social persecution if their son or husband surrendered. The collective punishment system ensured that individual soldiers faced pressure not just from military authority, but from their entire social network. The indoctrination went deeper still. Japanese military training included extensive discussion of how to commit suicide if capture became inevitable. Officers taught specific techniques: how to position a grenade against your chest to ensure death, how to use a rifle to shoot yourself if wounded and unable to move, how to save the last round in your pistol for yourself, rather than waste it on the enemy. This was taught not as a desperate last resort, but as the honorable response to military failure. Death in battle, even death by one's own hand to avoid capture, demonstrated loyalty to the emperor. Surrender demonstrated that the soldier valued his own life above his divine duty. It was the ultimate betrayal. American intelligence officers who interrogated the rare Japanese prisoners taken in early Pacific campaigns were disturbed by the consistency of these beliefs. Prisoners didn't express relief at having survived. They expressed shame and often requested to be executed. Many refused to cooperate with interrogation not because they were protecting military secrets, but because they considered themselves already dead. They had ceased to exist as Japanese citizens the moment they surrendered. Captain James Stockdale, a Navy intelligence officer who interviewed dozens of Japanese prisoners in 1943, wrote in a classified report that was declassified in 1978. These men are not fanatical in the sense we understand the term. They are not worked into frenzy or hysteria. They are calm, rational, and absolutely convinced that death is preferable to the dishonor of capture. They pity us for not understanding this basic truth. They see our willingness to take prisoners and our treatment of POWs as evidence of moral weakness. The psychological preparation extended to specific combat scenarios that American forces would encounter repeatedly throughout the Pacific War. Japanese soldiers were taught that retreat, even tactical retreat, to better defensive positions was unacceptable. Once committed to a position, they were expected to defend it to annihilation. This created tactical absurdities from a Western military perspective. German forces on the Eastern Front routinely conducted fighting retreats, trading space for time while preserving combat power. American forces in the Philippines in 1942 withdrew to Bataan when Manila became indefensible. These were considered sound military decisions. Japanese doctrine prohibited such flexibility. Officers who ordered retreats faced court-martial and execution. Soldiers who retreated faced summary execution by their own officers, or, if they survived, trial for cowardice that could result in their families being punished. The result was that Japanese defensive positions became death traps, where garrisons fought until literally everyone was dead. The Banzai Charge, which American troops encountered repeatedly from Guadalcanal onward, exemplified this psychology. When a defensive position became untenable, when ammunition ran low and casualties mounted, Japanese commanders would order a final mass assault. Hundreds or thousands of men would fix bayonets, shout the emperor's name, and charge directly into American machine gun fire. Western military analysis treated these charges as irrational desperation. They weren't. They were the logical conclusion of a belief system that valued death in attack over survival in defeat. The Banzai Charge offered individual soldiers the opportunity to die honorably while killing at least some enemies. Staying in their positions to be destroyed by artillery or airstrikes offered only passive death without honor. American forces, expecting enemies to behave rationally according to Western definitions of rationality, were repeatedly shocked by these attacks. Combat veterans from European theaters, accustomed to German soldiers who would surrender when surrounded or outgunned, found themselves facing Japanese troops who seemed to prefer suicide charges to tactical sense. The psychological gulf between American and Japanese military culture was perhaps widest regarding the concept of individual human value. American military culture, despite its necessary emphasis on discipline and mission accomplishment, retained the underlying premise that individual soldiers had inherent worth. Training aimed to keep soldiers alive while accomplishing objectives. Tactics emphasized combined arms and fire support to minimize friendly casualties. Japanese military culture started from the opposite premise. Individual soldiers had no inherent value. They were tools, ammunition to be expended in service to the emperor. Their lives belonged not to themselves, but to the state. Using those lives efficiently meant accepting death whenever it served military purposes, even marginally. This created strategic implications that American planners struggled to grasp. Japanese forces would garrison isolated islands, knowing that no reinforcement or resupply was possible. They would fight to the last man, defending positions that had no strategic value simply because retreat was unacceptable. They would waste irreplaceable veteran pilots in suicide attacks rather than preserve them for training new pilots. From a Western strategic perspective, these decisions were insane. They accelerated Japan's defeat by squandering limited resources. From within the Japanese military's psychological framework, they were necessary. Abandoning garrisons would undermine the belief system that held the military together. Ordering pilots to preserve themselves would suggest that individual survival mattered more than mission success. The ideology had to be maintained even at the cost of military effectiveness. By 1944, as American forces pushed closer to the Japanese home islands, the intensity of this indoctrinated belief system was reaching its peak. The kamikazes represented not a departure from Japanese military psychology, but its ultimate expression. And American casualties were about to spike in ways that would force military planners to confront a disturbing truth. They were fighting an enemy whose psychology they fundamentally did not understand, and that misunderstanding was going to cost thousands of American lives before the war ended. The collision between American expectations and Japanese reality reached its most lethal expression in the skies above the Philippine Sea on October 25, 1944. Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, commanding the 7th Fleet during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, watched from the bridge of his flagship as something unprecedented in naval warfare unfolded. Japanese aircraft were deliberately crashing into American ships, not accidentally, not as a last resort after being shot down, but intentionally, with pilots guiding damaged and undamaged aircraft alike directly into targets with no attempt to pull away or bail out. The escort carrier USS Street Low took 5 kamikaze hits within 18 minutes. The ship exploded, broke in half, and sank with 814 men. 4 other escort carriers sustained damage from deliberate crashes. Admiral Kinkaid's initial report to Pacific Fleet headquarters described the attacks as desperate tactics by pilots with insufficient training to conduct conventional bombing runs. He was wrong. The kamikazes weren't poorly trained pilots making the best of a bad situation. They were the operational deployment of a carefully planned program that had begun months earlier. A program built on the psychological foundation that Japanese military indoctrination had spent decades constructing. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, had formally established the 1st Kamikaze Unit on October 19, 1944, just 6 days before the Leyte Gulf attacks. But the concept had been developing within Japanese naval aviation circles since mid-1944, as it became clear that conventional tactics could no longer counter American air superiority. The mathematics were brutally simple. By October 1944, American carrier groups operated with overwhelming fighter coverage. A conventional Japanese bomber attempting to approach an American ship faced multiple layers of defense. Combat air patrol fighters would intercept most attackers dozens of miles from the fleet. Those that penetrated the fighter screen encountered anti-aircraft fire from dozens of ships, with radar-directed fire control that made high-altitude bombing increasingly suicidal. Japanese naval aviation had lost approximately 70% of its experienced pilots in the preceding 2 years. Replacement pilots received abbreviated training, sometimes as little as 40 hours of flight time before being sent to combat units. These poorly trained pilots had minimal chance of successfully delivering torpedoes or bombs against heavily defended targets using conventional attack profiles. But a kamikaze attack inverted the equation. The pilot didn't need to aim a bomb or torpedo. He simply needed to point his aircraft at a target and keep it pointed as he crashed. The plane itself became the weapon, loaded with explosives and fuel. The attack required less skill, was harder to defend against because the plane didn't need to pull away after weapon release, and guaranteed that the pilot's devotion would be absolute because he couldn't survive regardless of success or failure. Admiral Onishi hadn't invented the concept. He had formalized what Japanese pilots had already begun doing spontaneously. Throughout 1944, American ships had reported incidents of damaged Japanese aircraft, making deliberate ramming attacks rather than attempting to ditch or bail out. These weren't officially sanctioned tactics. They were individual decisions by pilots who had absorbed the lesson that death in attack was preferable to survival in failure. What Onishi did was transform individual desperation into systematic doctrine. He approached pilots with combat experience and proposed the formation of special attack units. The request was voluntary, in technical terms. In practical terms, within a culture where refusing such a request meant branding oneself a coward, it was anything but voluntary. 23 pilots volunteered immediately. Within a week, over 200 had stepped forward. They weren't suicidal in the clinical sense. They weren't depressed or seeking death. They were products of a system that had taught them, since childhood, that their lives had meaning only in service to the Emperor, and that the greatest service was to sacrifice themselves in a manner that harmed the enemy. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The first organized kamikaze attacks on October 25th demonstrated effectiveness that shocked American naval commanders. Of the 26 kamikaze aircraft that attacked that day, 6 achieved direct hits on carriers. That was a success rate of 23% compared to conventional bombing attacks during this period, which achieved hit rates below 5%. The tactical effectiveness was undeniable. A single kamikaze could sink or cripple a ship that might withstand multiple near misses from conventional bombs. The psychological impact was even more profound. American sailors had learned to cope with conventional air attacks. You watched for incoming bombers, fired your anti-aircraft guns, took evasive maneuvers, and hoped the bombs missed. Even when hit, you knew the enemy pilot was trying to survive the attack, which meant he had to pull away at some point. Kamikazes eliminated that psychological barrier. The pilot wasn't trying to survive. He was guiding his aircraft directly at your ship with the intention of dying in the impact. Shooting at the plane wasn't enough. You had to destroy it completely, blow it apart, or knock it so far off course that it missed. A damaged kamikaze that stayed airborne was still a threat until it crashed. Seaman James Fahey, serving aboard the light cruiser USS Montpelier, recorded his reaction to the first kamikaze attacks in his diary, which was published after the war in 1947. We'd seen Jap planes go down before. You'd watch the pilot bail out or see the plane ditch in the water. This was different. These pilots were aiming for us, and they weren't pulling away. Even when we hit them, even when the plane was on fire and breaking apart, they kept coming. It wasn't bravery. It was something else. Something that made your skin crawl because you realized they wanted to die as long as they took you with them. The kamikaze program expanded rapidly after its initial success. By November 1944, the Japanese Navy had organized multiple special attack units across the Philippines. The Army, observing the Navy's program, established its own kamikaze squadrons. Training programs were streamlined further. Pilots designated for special attacks received just enough instruction to take off, navigate to a target area, and control their aircraft in a terminal dive. American intelligence officers, analyzing captured documents and interrogating the handful of kamikaze pilots who survived crashes into the ocean and were rescued, pieced together the psychological preparation these pilots received. The process was sophisticated, designed to reinforce the ideological framework that Japanese servicemen had already internalized. Pilots selected for kamikaze missions were given several days of ceremonial preparation. They wrote farewell letters to their families. They were photographed in full uniform. They received ceremonial cups of sake and participated in formal ceremonies that framed their upcoming deaths as achieving the highest possible honor. The letters these pilots wrote, many of which survived the war and were published in Japanese collections during the 1950s, reveal the depth of their indoctrination. 22-year-old Flight Petty Officer Isao Matsuo wrote to his parents the day before his final mission in October 1944. "Please do not grieve for me. I am not sad. I am not afraid. Tomorrow I will crash into an enemy ship and die for the Emperor. This is the greatest honor our family could receive. I will become a god, and I will watch over you from Yasukuni Shrine. Be proud that your son fulfilled his duty to the divine Emperor." These weren't the words of a man forced to die against his will. Matsuo genuinely believed what he wrote. The belief system, constructed by decades of indoctrination, reinforced by military training, and validated by the social structure around him, had created a psychological state where death in service to the Emperor was not just acceptable, but desirable. American military psychiatrists, tasked with understanding the kamikaze phenomenon, struggled to fit it into existing frameworks. Western psychology recognized self-destructive behavior, suicide, and even suicidal courage in combat. But those concepts assumed that death was being accepted as a necessary cost of achieving some other goal. The kamikaze reversed that equation. Death was the goal. Damaging the enemy ship was important, but secondary to the act of dying in the proper manner. Dr. Alexander Layton, a Navy psychiatrist who studied kamikaze psychology in 1945, wrote in a classified report that was declassified in 1982, "We are confronting a psychological system fundamentally different from Western norms. These pilots are not mentally ill. They are not brainwashed in the sense we understand coercive indoctrination. They are products of a comprehensive cultural system that assigns meaning and value in ways antithetical to individualist Western philosophy. They see their deaths as transcendent acts that benefit their families, honor their ancestors, and serve divine purpose. Our frameworks for understanding human motivation cannot adequately explain this because they assume individual self-preservation as a basic human drive. For these pilots, self-preservation has been subordinated to collective identity in ways that make death not merely acceptable, but meaningful." The effectiveness of the kamikaze campaign, measured in American casualties and damaged ships, was devastating. Between October 1944 and the end of the war in August 1945, approximately 2,800 kamikaze pilots flew suicide missions. They sank 34 American ships, damaged 368 others, killed 4,900 American sailors, and wounded an additional 4,600. No other weapon system employed by Japan in the final year of the war achieved comparable results. Conventional air attacks, submarine operations, and surface naval engagements combined produced fewer American casualties than the kamikazes. From a purely tactical standpoint, trading one pilot and one aircraft to sink or damage an American warship was brutally efficient, especially given that Japan lacked the resources to train pilots for conventional operations anyway. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. But the kamikaze program represented more than tactical adaptation. It was the complete expression of the psychological system that Japanese military culture had built, and it forced American military planners to confront a disturbing question. If ordinary Japanese soldiers and pilots were willing to die deliberately in combat, what would happen when American forces attempted to invade the Japanese home islands? The answer to that question emerged with horrifying clarity during the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945. These were not remote colonial territories. They were, in the Japanese conception, parts of Japan proper. Iwo Jima was administered as part of Tokyo Prefecture. Okinawa was historically the Ryukyu Kingdom, but had been fully integrated into Japan in the late 19th century. American planners expected fierce resistance on both islands. What they encountered was something categorically different from previous Pacific battles. On Iwo Jima, a volcanic rock 8 square miles in area, 21,000 Japanese defenders faced 70,000 American Marines beginning February 19, 1945. The battle lasted 36 days. When it ended, 20,683 Japanese soldiers were dead. Only 216 had surrendered, a survival rate of 1%. American casualties were equally staggering. 6,800 Marines killed, 19,000 wounded. Nearly 30% of the attacking force became casualties, taking an island that had no civilian population and minimal strategic value beyond its airfields. The casualty ratio was unprecedented in American military history. Previous Pacific Island battles had produced Japanese casualty rates around 95%, with 5% captured. Iwo Jima pushed that to 99% dead. The difference lay in the defensive tactics employed by Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the island's commander. Kuribayashi was a realist who understood that Iwo Jima could not be held indefinitely, but he also understood that his mission was not to win, but to kill as many Americans as possible before his garrison was annihilated. He forbade banzai charges, which wasted men in futile attacks. Instead, he ordered construction of an elaborate network of tunnels, bunkers, and fighting positions designed to maximize American casualties. Japanese soldiers would allow Marines to advance past their positions, then emerge from hidden bunkers to attack from behind. They would defend a position until it became untenable, then withdraw through tunnels to another prepared position and continue fighting. They would wait in sealed caves for days, surviving on minimal water and food, until Americans approached close enough to be killed with grenades or small arms fire. This wasn't the traditional Japanese defense of fighting to the last man in place. It was a calculated system designed to trade Japanese lives for American lives at the most advantageous ratio possible. And it worked. The Marines captured Iwo Jima, but the cost shook American commanders who were planning the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Okinawa, beginning April 1st, 1945, was worse. The island was larger, more heavily defended, and included a substantial civilian population. 100,000 Japanese troops faced 500,000 American soldiers, sailors, and Marines in a battle that lasted 82 days. The Japanese defense employed the same principles Kuribayashi had pioneered on Iwo Jima, but on a vastly larger scale. Instead of defending the beaches, Japanese forces retreated to prepared positions in the interior, forcing Americans to fight through multiple defensive lines while subjected to constant artillery fire, infiltration attacks, and kamikaze strikes. Kamikaze attacks reached their peak intensity during the Okinawa campaign. Between April and June 1945, nearly 1,500 kamikaze aircraft attacked the American fleet supporting the invasion. They sank 36 ships and damaged 368 more. Over 4,000 American sailors died, more than the total American naval casualties in all previous Pacific battles combined. On land, Japanese tactics reached levels of desperation and ruthlessness that horrified even hardened Marines. Japanese soldiers would strap explosives to themselves and hurl themselves under American tanks. They would pretend to surrender, then detonate hidden grenades when Americans approached. They would hide in caves with civilians, using them as human shields or forcing them to commit suicide rather than allow them to be captured. The civilian casualties on Okinawa revealed another dimension of Japanese military psychology that American planners had not fully appreciated. Approximately 150,000 Okinawan civilians died during the battle, many by suicide encouraged or forced by Japanese military authorities. Japanese soldiers told civilians that Americans would torture, rape, and murder them if captured. They encouraged families to commit collective suicide using grenades or by jumping from cliffs. They shot civilians who attempted to surrender to American forces. The military's psychological framework, which held that death was preferable to dishonor, extended to civilians who were expected to choose death rather than live under American occupation. American forces attempting to save civilians encountered situations for which no training had prepared them. Marines would find families hiding in caves, try to coax them out with offers of food and safety, and watch as parents killed their children and themselves rather than surrender. The trauma this inflicted on American troops was profound and lasting. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, who fought on Okinawa and later wrote one of the war's most acclaimed combat memoirs, described finding a cave where an entire extended family had committed suicide. They'd used a grenade. Parents, grandparents, children. The youngest couldn't have been more than 3 years old. I couldn't understand it. We were trying to help them. We had food, medicine, safety. But they chose death. Their own military had convinced them we were monsters, and they believed it so completely that killing their own children seemed merciful. That's when I understood we weren't just fighting an army. We were fighting a belief system that had poisoned an entire culture. By June 1945, when Okinawa was finally secured, American casualties totaled over 62,000, including 12,000 dead. Japanese military casualties exceeded 100,000 dead with roughly 7,000 captured. The kill ratio was roughly 8 Japanese dead for every American casualty, but the absolute numbers were staggering, and Okinawa was just a single island. American planners, looking at maps of the Japanese home islands, with a population of 70 million people and millions of military personnel and armed civilians, faced a calculation that was almost unbearable. If taking an island of 400,000 people cost 60,000 American casualties, what would invading the home islands cost? The Joint Chiefs of Staff commissioned multiple studies in spring and summer of 1945, attempting to project casualties for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. The estimates varied widely depending on assumptions about Japanese resistance, but even the most optimistic projections were horrifying. The invasion of Kyushu, scheduled for November 1945, was expected to produce American casualties between 75,000 and 100,000 in the first month alone. The subsequent invasion of the main island of Honshu, scheduled for March 1946, was projected to cost hundreds of thousands of additional casualties. Some estimates suggested total American casualties could exceed 1 million. These weren't wild guesses. They were based on mathematical extrapolation from actual combat experience. Japanese military resistance had intensified as American forces approached the home islands. The percentage of Japanese soldiers choosing death over surrender had increased. The willingness to employ suicide tactics had expanded from special attack units to ordinary infantry. The involvement of civilians in combat had grown. Intelligence reports from mid-1945 indicated that the Japanese government was arming civilians with bamboo spears, training them in suicide attacks with explosives, and preparing the population for a final battle that would turn the home islands into one vast killing ground. The militarist government had issued directives calling for 100 million deaths with honor rather than surrender. American planners had to confront the possibility that they were facing an enemy whose psychology made negotiated peace impossible and military defeat almost unbearably costly. The indoctrination that began in elementary schools, that was reinforced through military training, and that had been demonstrated in thousands of battlefield actions, had created a situation where the Japanese military and civilian population might genuinely prefer collective suicide to surrender. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, reviewing casualty projections in July 1945, wrote in his diary, "We are facing a race that has been taught from childhood that death in service to the Emperor is the highest honor. They have demonstrated this belief thousands of times. Iwo Jima and Okinawa suggest that invasion of the home islands will produce casualties that the American public may not accept. We have destroyed their navy, demolished their air force, blockaded their islands, and burned their cities. Yet they show no sign of surrendering. We are confronting a psychological phenomenon that our military doctrine did not prepare us to face." The strategic bombing campaign that had devastated Japanese cities throughout 1945 had failed to break Japanese will to resist. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and dozens of other cities had been reduced to ash by incendiary raids. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9 through 10, 1945, killed an estimated 100,000 civilians in a single night. Yet the Japanese government continued to issue statements promising to fight to the last citizen. American psychological warfare efforts had proven equally ineffective. Millions of leaflets were dropped over Japanese cities, explaining that continued resistance was futile, that surrender would not result in the atrocities Japanese propaganda claimed, that Americans would treat prisoners humanely according to international law. The few Japanese soldiers who surrendered confirmed that they'd read the leaflets and knew they were true. They had surrendered precisely because they chose to reject the indoctrination they'd received. But they represented a tiny fraction of Japanese forces. The vast majority either didn't see the leaflets, didn't believe them, or believed them but still chose death over the dishonor of surrender. By late July 1945, American military and political leadership faced a decision point. They could proceed with Operation Downfall, accepting casualties that might exceed anything in American military history. They could continue the blockade and bombing campaign, hoping that eventually material deprivation would force Japanese surrender despite psychological resistance. Or they could employ the newly developed atomic bomb and attempt to shock the Japanese government into surrender through demonstration of absolutely overwhelming destructive power. The decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th has been debated for decades. But within the context of understanding Japanese military psychology in mid-1945, the decision made brutal sense to American planners. Every other form of pressure, military defeat, material destruction, conventional bombing, blockade, had failed to convince the Japanese military to surrender. The psychological framework that valued death over dishonor, that saw the emperor as divine, and that treated individual life as meaningless compared to collective sacrifice, had proven resistant to every form of conventional military pressure. The atomic bombs weren't just weapons of mass destruction. They were psychological weapons aimed at breaking a belief system that conventional warfare couldn't touch. The hope was that destruction so absolute, so incomprehensible in scale, would finally convince Japanese leadership that continued resistance meant not honorable death but total annihilation, including the imperial institution itself. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel